2 a.m. You're alone in your house. Every creak, every whisper of wind makes your heart race. Now imagine experiencing that terror for 6 straight years while bombs fall around you and monsters in human form hunt you through the darkness. Tonight, I'm going to share with you 10 true horror stories from World War II that make our worst nightmares seem like bedtime fairy tales. These aren't your typical war stories. These are the accounts that military historians whisper about in hushed tones. The incidents that survivors took to their graves. The moments when ordinary people faced evil so pure and terror so absolute that it changed the very fabric of reality around them. But here's what's truly terrifying. Every single story you're about to hear actually happened. Real people, real places, real horror that unfolded across our world just 80 years ago. Are you ready to descend into the darkest chapters of human history? Because once we begin this journey together, there's no turning back. And I promise you, by the time we reach story number 10, you'll understand why some veterans never spoke about what they witnessed over there. So turn off your lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for 10 tales that will remind you why the darkness should always be feared. In the closing days of World War II, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin and the Third Reich crumbled around him, Heinrich Himmler authorized one final operation that would determine the ultimate legacy of Nazi occult research. This wasn't a military operation designed to change the outcome of the war. This was something far more ambitious and terrifying. The Ahnenerbe, Himmler's research organization dedicated to proving Aryan racial superiority through archaeological and occult studies, had spent 6 years collecting artifacts, conducting rituals, and exploring supernatural phenomena throughout occupied Europe. As defeat became inevitable, these researchers faced a critical decision. They could allow their accumulated knowledge to be captured by Allied forces, or they could use it for one final experiment that would ensure their ideology survived the destruction of their physical empire. Professor Otto Weisthor had been leading the Ahnenerbe's most classified research program since 1940. His team of archaeologists, anthropologists, and occult researchers had collected artifacts from ancient sites throughout Europe, artifacts that predated Christian civilization and connected to belief systems that had been deliberately suppressed for millennia. But Weisthor wasn't just collecting historical curiosities. He was assembling the components for a ritual that would fundamentally alter the nature of human consciousness itself. The theoretical foundation for this ritual came from discoveries made at ancient sites in Tibet, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe. Sites where archaeological evidence suggested that pre-Christian civilizations had achieved direct communication with non-human intelligences. Entities that existed outside normal space and time but could influence physical reality through properly conducted ceremonies. Weisthor believed that these ancient rituals could be adapted using modern scientific methods to create a permanent channel between human consciousness and these entities. A channel that would allow Nazi ideology to survive the destruction of the Third Reich by embedding it directly into the collective unconscious of human civilization. But conducting such a ritual required specific components that had taken years to collect. First, they needed artifacts that had been used in successful contact rituals by ancient civilizations. Weisthor's teams had acquired 17 such artifacts from sites throughout occupied Europe, often by murdering archaeologists and religious leaders who attempted to protect them. Second, they needed human subjects who possessed what Weisthor called psychic conductivity. Individuals with natural sensitivity to supernatural phenomena who could serve as living conduits during the ritual process. These subjects were obtained from concentration camps, mental hospitals, and occult organizations throughout Nazi territory. Third, and most importantly, they needed a location where the boundary between physical reality and supernatural dimensions was naturally weak. A place where previous rituals had already established pathways for non-human entities to enter our world. Weisthor found that location in a series of ancient caves beneath Wilsberg Castle, which Himmler had converted into a ceremonial center for SS leadership development. Archaeological surveys revealed that these caves had been used for ritual purposes for over 3,000 years, creating what Weisthor described as dimensional scarring that made supernatural contact significantly easier. The final ritual began on April 20th, 1945, Hitler's birthday, and exactly 12 days before he would commit suicide in his Berlin bunker. But this timing wasn't coincidental. Weisthor had calculated that the psychic energy generated by the simultaneous destruction of Nazi leadership would provide the power necessary to complete his dimensional gateway. 12 psychically sensitive subjects were positioned around a circular chamber carved from the living rock beneath Wheelsburg. Each subject was connected to ancient artifacts through copper wires that had been inscribed with symbols copied from the oldest ritual sites in Europe. As Allied artillery grew closer and the Nazi regime entered its death throes, Weisthor began the incantations that would open permanent communication channels with the entities that had been guiding human civilization from the shadows for millennia. The ritual worked, but not in the way Weisthor had intended. Instead of creating a pathway for Nazi ideology to influence future human development, the ritual opened multiple dimensional gateways that allowed various non-human entities to establish permanent residence in our reality. Entities that had their own agendas for humanity's future. SS Sturmbannführer Klaus Weber was Weisthor's assistant and the only member of the research team to survive the ritual. His testimony, given to Allied interrogators and immediately classified, describes what happened in that underground chamber as reality itself began to unravel. Weber reported that the 12 psychic subjects began speaking in unison, but not in any human language. They were channeling communications from entities that existed in dimensions adjacent to our own. Entities that had been waiting for exactly this type of invitation to enter our world permanently. But these entities weren't interested in promoting Nazi ideology or Aryan racial superiority. They were interested in something far more fundamental: the complete transformation of human consciousness into forms that would serve their purposes. As the ritual progressed, Weber watched the 12 subjects undergo physical changes that he described as evolutionary acceleration. Their bone structure began to alter. Their brain capacity increased visibly. Their sensory capabilities expanded beyond normal human ranges. But most disturbing of all, their personalities were completely replaced by something else. Something that retained human memories and knowledge but applied them toward goals that were utterly alien to human nature. Weber realized that Weisthor's ritual hadn't just contacted non-human entities. It had provided them with human bodies to inhabit permanently. Bodies that could move through normal society without detection while serving as advance agents for a larger invasion force. The ritual was interrupted when Allied bombing damaged the cave system and caused partial collapse of the ceremonial chamber. Weisthor and 10 of the 12 subjects were killed instantly, but the 2 surviving subjects disappeared during the confusion of the castle's capture. Weber was captured and extensively interrogated by Allied intelligence officers who were specifically tasked with investigating Nazi occult research. His testimony was corroborated by physical evidence found in the damaged ceremonial chamber, including artifacts that appeared to defy conventional physics and biological samples that couldn't be classified as entirely human. But here's where Weber's story becomes relevant to our modern world. Because according to his testimony, the 2 surviving subjects from the ritual didn't just disappear. They began a systematic campaign to recruit others for the same transformation process. Weber claimed that these entities, wearing human bodies but serving alien purposes, had the ability to identify individuals with the psychic sensitivity necessary for hosting non-human consciousness. They would approach these individuals gradually, using psychological manipulation techniques that made the transformation process seem like spiritual enlightenment or personal evolution. Over the following decades, Weber tracked what he believed was a growing network of these transformed individuals infiltrating positions of influence throughout post-war society. Government agencies, religious organizations, scientific institutions, media companies, anywhere that decisions were made that affected large numbers of people. Weber's evidence was largely circumstantial, but the patterns he documented were disturbing. Policy decisions that seemed designed to increase human suffering and social instability. Scientific research that was redirected away from beneficial applications toward projects with no apparent purpose except to expand human vulnerability to psychological manipulation. Religious movements that promoted surrender of individual consciousness to collective entities. Educational programs that discouraged critical thinking and encouraged acceptance of authority without question. As if some invisible force was gradually conditioning human civilization to accept a transition away from individual consciousness toward some form of collective mental control. Weber died in 1963, but not before establishing a network of researchers dedicated to monitoring what he called the infiltration process. These researchers, working independently in various countries, continued documenting evidence of non-human influence over human institutions. Their combined research suggests that the entities contacted through Weister's ritual have been remarkably successful in establishing permanent presence in our reality. Not through dramatic invasion or obvious conquest, but through gradual transformation of human consciousness itself. The evidence they've collected points to a coordinated campaign designed to prepare humanity for what can only be described as voluntary enslavement. A process so gradual and carefully orchestrated that most people would welcome it as progress rather than recognize it as the end of human independence. But here's the most terrifying aspect of Weber's final warnings. According to his analysis, the transformation process initiated at Wheelsburg was never intended to be limited to the 12 original subjects. It was designed to be self-replicating, spreading from person to person through psychological and spiritual contact rather than physical infection. Which means that anyone who has been exposed to certain ideas, certain belief systems, certain forms of media or education might already be carrying the seeds of this transformation within their own consciousness. Weber's last documented communication, a letter found in his personal effects after his death, contained a simple test that he claimed could identify whether someone had been affected by the infiltration process. The test involved examining your own thoughts and motivations with complete honesty. If you found yourself consistently making decisions that served collective interests rather than personal ones, if you felt drawn to surrender your individual identity to larger groups or causes, if you experienced thoughts that seemed to come from outside your own mind, you might already be in the early stages of transformation. But here's the real horror of Weber's warning. By the time you become aware of the transformation process, it may already be too late to resist it. Because the entities that initiated this process understand human psychology better than humans understand it themselves. They know exactly how to make enslavement feel like enlightenment, how to make surrender feel like victory, how to make the end of human independence feel like the beginning of human transcendence. And according to Weber's final calculations, based on observable changes in human behavior patterns over the past 70 years, the transformation process is nearing completion, which means that the war that began in 1939 never really ended. It just shifted to a battlefield that exists inside human consciousness itself. A battlefield where the weapons are ideas, the soldiers are thoughts, and the victory condition is the complete replacement of human nature with something else entirely. Something that will retain human appearance and human memories, but will serve purposes that are fundamentally alien to everything we consider human. Makes you wonder what thoughts are really your own, doesn't it? And whether the voice inside your head that's processing these words right now is entirely human in origin. Hunger changes people in ways that go far beyond the physical. When starvation reaches its final stages, it strips away everything we consider human civilization and reveals the primitive survival instincts that lurk beneath our cultivated exteriors. But during the siege of Leningrad, hunger became something else entirely. something that transformed not just individuals, but entire communities into something unrecognizable. The siege lasted 872 days, nearly 3 years of complete isolation as German forces surrounded the city and slowly squeezed the life from its inhabitants. Food became more precious than gold, then more precious than life itself. Anya Petrov was a schoolteacher before the war, responsible for educating the children of Leningrad's factory workers. She was a gentle woman who believed in the fundamental goodness of human nature. The siege changed her perspective in ways that would haunt her for the rest of her life. By the winter of 1942, Anya's school had been converted into a makeshift shelter for families whose homes had been destroyed by bombing. 43 people shared the building's meager heat and dwindling food supplies. They tried to maintain some semblance of normal life, but normal was becoming a concept that belonged to a different world. The first death came in December. Old Mr. Volkov simply didn't wake up one morning, his body finally surrendering to the combination of cold and malnutrition that was claiming thousands of lives throughout the city. According to civilized protocol, his body should have been taken to one of the mass burial sites outside the city. But traveling outside meant risking death from German artillery, and the ground was frozen too hard to dig proper graves. So Mr. Volkov's body was moved to the school's basement, where the cold would preserve it until spring. That decision marked the beginning of their descent into something that can't be called survival, because survival implies remaining human. By January, 4 more people had died. Mrs. Komarova, her infant daughter, teenage Pavel, and a man whose name Anya never learned. 5 bodies in the basement, preserved by temperatures that never rose above freezing. That's when little Katia Novak made the suggestion that changed everything. Katia was 8 years old, small for her age, and dying slowly from hunger like everyone else in the city. She had been staring at the basement door for hours when she turned to Anya and asked in a voice that sounded far too old for her years, "Why are we letting them go to waste?" Anya knew exactly what Katia meant. They all did. The thought had been growing in everyone's mind like a cancer, fed by the constant gnawing pain in their stomachs and the knowledge that they were all going to die anyway. The human body contains approximately 65 pounds of edible protein. They held a meeting that night, 43 living people sitting in a circle, discussing something that should have been unthinkable. But hunger has a way of making the unthinkable seem reasonable, necessary, inevitable. The vote was unanimous. Anya volunteered to prepare the first meal. Her background as a teacher had included some basic knowledge of human anatomy, and she felt responsible for guiding the group through this transition. She chose Mr. Volkov because he had been the first to die and his body was the most preserved. But cutting into human flesh for the first time broke something inside Anya's mind, something that never properly healed. As she worked in the basement that night, using kitchen knives and a saw borrowed from the school's workshop, Anya began to hear voices, whispers coming from the other bodies stacked against the walls. At first, she assumed it was her imagination, stress-induced hallucinations brought on by the horror of what she was doing. But the voices became clearer, more distinct, and they weren't speaking Russian. The dead were speaking in languages that Anya didn't recognize, ancient languages that seemed to bypass her ears and speak directly to the primitive parts of her brain. They were giving her instructions, teaching her techniques for butchering human meat more efficiently, showing her which organs contained the most nutrition and which parts of the body were safe to consume. But most disturbing of all, they were telling her that what she was doing wasn't wrong. They said that humans had always been cannibals, that civilization was just a thin veneer covering humanity's true nature. They said that the siege was simply returning the people of Leningrad to their authentic selves. The voices told her she was becoming something better than human. The first meal was served the next evening. Thin slices of meat in a watery soup, seasoned with salt and the last of their winter vegetables. Everyone ate in silence, avoiding eye contact, trying not to think about what they were consuming. But something happened to them as they ate, something beyond simple nutrition. Anya noticed it first in herself. The constant weakness that had plagued her for months began to fade. Her thinking became clearer. Her eyesight improved. Most remarkably, she felt stronger than she had since before the siege began. The others experienced similar changes. People who had been barely able to walk suddenly had energy to move around the building. Elderly residents who had been prepared to die found renewed vitality. Children who had been listless and unresponsive became alert and active. They weren't just surviving on their cannibalistic diet. They were thriving, but the changes went beyond physical improvement. Their behavior began to shift in subtle ways that became more pronounced with each meal. They stopped feeling guilt about what they were eating. They stopped seeing their former neighbors as people who had died tragically. Instead, they began to see them as resources that had been thoughtfully provided. By March, the group had consumed all 5 bodies from the basement. But rather than returning to their previous state of starvation, they had developed an insatiable hunger for human flesh specifically. Regular food, when they could find it, no longer satisfied them. Tasted bland and provided no real nourishment. They needed more bodies. Anya organized hunting parties that would venture out into the city at night, searching for fresh corpses among the thousands of victims that littered Leningrad streets. But even corpses were becoming scarce as other survivors had begun collecting them for the same purpose. That's when the group made a collective decision that transformed them from desperate survivors into something else entirely. They began killing healthy people. Their first victim was a stranger who had sought shelter in their building during a bombardment. A middle-aged man who had been traveling through the city trying to reach his family. The group surrounded him while he slept and killed him with kitchen knives, careful not to damage too much of the usable meat. As they butchered his body, Anya heard the voices again. But now they weren't just offering instructions. They were offering congratulations. They told her that she and her group had successfully transformed into humanity's next evolutionary stage. Beings who consumed their own species not from desperation, but from biological necessity. The voices said that this had always been humanity's destiny, that wars, famines, and disasters were just nature's way of creating the conditions necessary for this transformation to occur. Over the remaining months of the siege, Anya's group killed and consumed 47 additional people. Men, women, children, anyone who was unlucky enough to encounter them. They developed sophisticated techniques for luring victims, butchering bodies efficiently, and disposing of evidence. But here's the detail that makes this story truly horrifying. They weren't the only group in Leningrad that had undergone this transformation. Anya began encountering other cannibalistic communities throughout the city, groups that had made the same transition from desperation to predation. They would recognize each other instantly, drawn together by changes in their scent, their movements, their eyes. They began to coordinate their activities, sharing territory and techniques. By the end of the siege, Anya estimated that nearly 10% of Leningrad's surviving population had become active cannibals. When the siege was finally lifted in January 1944, these groups faced a new challenge. The return of normal food supplies and the restoration of law and order threatened to expose their activities. But they had already evolved beyond the point where they could return to conventional human behavior. Anya's group made a collective decision to disperse throughout the Soviet Union, maintaining contact through coded letters and prearranged meetings. They would integrate into normal society while continuing to feed their transformed appetites through careful selection of isolated victims. Anya moved to Moscow, where she resumed her career as a teacher. For 34 years, She maintained the appearance of a normal, productive citizen. But according to her private journals, discovered after her death in 1978, she never stopped hunting. Her journals document the murders of 83 people over 3 decades. Men and women who disappeared from Moscow streets with no apparent connection to each other. Anya would select victims who were unlikely to be missed. Homeless individuals, foreign visitors, people who lived alone with no close family ties. But the most disturbing aspect of her journals was her description of a growing network of cannibals throughout the Soviet Union. Former Leningrad residents who had maintained their transformed nature and recruited others to join them. According to Anya's final entries, written just days before her death, this network had grown to include thousands of members across multiple countries. They had learned to blend into normal society while maintaining their predatory nature. They held regular gatherings where they would share victims and exchange techniques. And they were planning something larger. Anya's last journal entry described preparations for what she called the next siege, a coordinated campaign to create the conditions necessary for widespread cannibalistic transformation. Wars, famines, natural disasters, events that would push normal humans beyond their breaking point and force them to make the same choices that had transformed the survivors of Leningrad. The journal ends with a list of names and locations. Government officials, military leaders, disaster relief coordinators. People who were in positions to influence how societies responded to large-scale emergencies. People who had supposedly died during various crises over the past 30 years, but whose names appeared on Anya's recruitment list. Makes you wonder what other transformations might be spreading quietly through our world, hidden beneath the veneer of normal human society. Doesn't it? Deep in the German countryside lies a forest that even today, locals refuse to enter after sunset. The Hurtgen Forest. American soldiers called it the Green Hell, but what they discovered there was far worse than any hell described in Scripture. It was November 1944. The 28th Infantry Division had been fighting through these dense woods for weeks. Trees so thick that daylight barely penetrated. Mud so deep it swallowed men whole. But it wasn't the terrain that broke these soldiers. It was what they found hanging from the branches. Private First Class Tommy Richardson was on night patrol when he first heard them. The screams, not battle cries or death rattles, but something else entirely. Something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The sounds were coming from deep within the forest, where no living thing should be. His squad leader, Sergeant Mills, ordered them to investigate. You know what they say about following orders, right? Sometimes disobedience is the difference between going home and becoming a cautionary tale. As they pushed deeper into the blackness, Richardson noticed something odd. The screaming would stop whenever they moved, then resume the moment they stood still. Almost like whatever was making those sounds was watching them, waiting for them. Then Richardson's flashlight caught something in the trees ahead. At first, he thought it was equipment left by retreating German forces. But as they moved closer, the horrifying truth became clear. Hanging from nearly every branch were German soldiers. But they weren't dead. Not all of them. Some were still moving, still screaming. These men had been stripped naked and hung by their ankles from ropes that cut deep into their flesh. Their fingernails were gone, torn away as they clawed at the bark trying to free themselves. Their eyes had been removed, and carved into their chests were symbols that Richardson would later learn were ancient Germanic runes. But here's where the story takes a turn that will make you question everything you think you know about that war. Because hanging among those German soldiers were American GIs. Men from Richardson's own division who had gone missing weeks earlier. Sergeant Mills approached one of the hanging Americans, a kid named Danny Walsh from Ohio. Walsh was barely conscious, his voice just a whisper. Mills leaned in close to hear Walsh's final words. And what Walsh told him in those last moments would haunt Mills for the rest of his short life. Walsh said they hadn't been captured by German soldiers. They'd been taken by something else. Something that wore German uniforms but moved like animals in the darkness. Something that spoke in voices that echoed from everywhere and nowhere at once. You want to know the really terrifying part? Richardson's patrol found 17 more groves just like this one scattered throughout the Hurtgen forest, each one containing dozens of hanging victims from both armies, each one marked with those same ancient symbols. The official military reports listed these men as killed in action, missing in action, anything but the truth. Because how do you explain to a grieving mother that her son wasn't killed by enemy soldiers, but by something that shouldn't exist in the modern world? Richardson made it home after the war, but he never spoke about what happened in those woods. Not until 1987, when he was dying of cancer and decided the truth needed to be told. He gave one interview to a local newspaper. 3 days later, he was found dead in his hospital bed. Natural causes, they said, but the nurse who found him swore that his eyes had been removed, and carved into his chest was a symbol she'd never seen before. The police report made no mention of these details. The Hurtgen forest still stands today. 79 years later, local hunters report finding fresh rope marks on the trees, fresh symbols carved into the bark. And on certain nights when the wind is just right, you can still hear the screaming. Makes you wonder what else might be lurking in the forgotten corners of our world. Doesn't it? There are some sounds that once heard can never be forgotten. The screech of metal on metal, the hiss of steam under pressure, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on railroad tracks. For most people, these are ordinary sounds of industrial progress. But for the residents of the small Polish town near Sobibor, these sounds became the soundtrack to their worst nightmares. You see, every night at exactly 11:47 p.m., a train would pass through their town heading east toward the Sobibor extermination camp. A train loaded with human cargo. Men, women, and children packed into cattle cars so tightly that some died standing up before they ever reached their destination. But here's where this story becomes truly terrifying. That train stopped running in October 1943 when the camp was shut down. Yet the townspeople continued to hear it. Every single night. Same time, same route, same sounds of humans suffering echoing through the darkness. Maria Kowalski lived closest to the railroad tracks. She was a simple farmer's wife who had somehow survived the occupation by keeping her head down and her mouth shut. But survival came with a price. Every night, she was forced to listen to the phantom train carry its ghostly passengers to their doom. At first, Maria tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. Trauma playing tricks on her mind. We all tell ourselves comfortable lies when the truth is too horrible to accept, don't we? But then other townspeople began reporting the same phenomenon. The baker heard it. The priest heard it. Even the German soldiers stationed nearby heard it and demanded to know which trains were still running that route. The answer was none. No trains had used those tracks for months. Maria decided to investigate. On a cold December night in 1943, she wrapped herself in her warmest coat and walked to the railroad crossing to wait for the phantom train. As 11:47 approached, she felt the temperature drop 20 degrees in seconds. Her breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. Then she heard it, that familiar whistle in the distance, growing closer. The ground began to vibrate beneath her feet. But when she looked down the tracks, she saw nothing. No light from an engine. No silhouette of train cars against the moonlit sky. Just empty tracks stretching into darkness. Yet the sounds grew louder. The whistle, the steam, the clacking of wheels. And then, something that made Maria's heart stop beating for several terrifying seconds. She heard voices. Hundreds of voices crying out in fear and desperation. Voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize, pleading for help in tongues that had been silenced forever. As the invisible train passed by her position, Maria felt a wind that carried with it the stench of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else. Something metallic and sweet that she would later realize was the smell of blood. But the most horrifying moment came when the phantom train began to slow down, as if it were stopping right there at the crossing. Maria heard the screech of brakes, the hiss of releasing steam, the sound of heavy doors sliding open, and then footsteps, dozens of footsteps moving across the gravel, moving toward her. Maria ran home that night faster than she had ever run in her life. She locked every door, closed every curtain, and huddled in her basement until dawn. But as she hid there in the darkness, she could hear them. The passengers from the phantom train. They were walking through her town, searching for something. For the next 3 years, until Maria finally fled to America, the phantom train continued its nightly journey. But now it wasn't just passing through. Now it was stopping. And each night, more ghostly passengers would disembark and wander the empty streets of the town. Local records show that 17 townspeople disappeared during those 3 years, vanished without a trace on nights when the phantom train was heard. Their bodies were never found. But sometimes, residents reported hearing new voices among the phantom passengers, familiar voices of their missing neighbors. Maria Kowalski lived to be 92 years old. She settled in Chicago and rarely spoke about her experiences in Poland. But on her deathbed, she made her granddaughter promise to never take a train after 11 p.m. Because according to Maria, some passengers never reach their final destination. They just keep riding forever, searching for others to join their eternal journey. The railroad tracks near Sobibor were torn up in 1947. The ground was paved over and turned into a highway. But even today, truck drivers report strange experiences on that stretch of road. Equipment malfunctions, radio static, and at exactly 11:47 p.m., their vehicle's headlights will sometimes illuminate figures walking alongside the highway. Figures that vanish the moment the drivers slow down for a closer look. Think about that the next time you're driving alone at night and see someone walking on the side of the road. Are they really looking for a ride to somewhere? Or are they looking for passengers to take somewhere else entirely? Some places hold onto their pain long after the suffering has ended. They absorb the agony like a sponge absorbs water, releasing it slowly over decades in ways that chill the soul. Terezin, a fortress town in Czechoslovakia, became one of those places during World War II. But this isn't just another story about a concentration camp. This is about something far more sinister that happened there. The Nazis turned Terezin into what they cynically called a model ghetto, a place where Jewish families were temporarily housed before being transported to death camps. What made Terezin unique was that it contained a large population of children, thousands of them ranging in age from infants to teenagers. These children were kept in separate barracks, away from their parents. The Nazis claimed it was for their protection, for their education, but the truth was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Sister Agnes was a Czech nun who worked secretly with the resistance, smuggling food and medicine into the ghetto. She had access to areas that most people never saw, including the children's barracks late at night. What Sister Agnes witnessed there would shake her faith to its very foundation. She first noticed it during her third visit to the children's section. As she distributed bread among the younger ones, she observed something odd about their behavior. These kids, who should have been traumatized and withdrawn, seemed almost unnaturally calm. They would stare at fixed points in empty space for hours. They would whisper to themselves in languages that weren't Czech, German, or Yiddish, and they all drew the same pictures. Every child, regardless of age or artistic ability, would draw identical images when given paper and pencil. Dark figures with elongated limbs standing around a circular table. Always the same composition, always the same proportions, as if they were all seeing the same thing. Sister Agnes asked 8-year-old Rachel Goldstein about her drawing. Rachel looked up with eyes that seemed far too old for her face and said something that made Sister Agnes step backward in fear. Rachel said the tall shadows came to visit them every night after the guards fell asleep. She said they would stand around the children's beds and whisper secrets about what was coming, about the special purpose these children would serve. At first, Sister Agnes assumed this was just childhood imagination coping with trauma. But then she decided to stay overnight in the children's barracks to see for herself what was happening. Nothing could have prepared her for what she witnessed. At exactly 2:15 a.m., the temperature in the barracks dropped dramatically. Sister Agnes could see her breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Then the children began to stir, not waking up exactly, but moving in their sleep as if responding to some unheard signal. One by one, they sat up in their beds, eyes still closed, all facing the same direction, toward the center of the room where nothing visible stood. But Sister Agnes felt a presence there, something massive and cold that seemed to absorb light from the surrounding area. She watched in horror as the children began to speak in unison, not in any human language, but in sounds that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the primitive fear centers of the brain. The dark presence responded. Sister Agnes couldn't see it, but she could feel it moving around the room, stopping at each child's bed. Whatever it was examining them, selecting them for something. Then 11-year-old David Weiss stood up and walked to the center of the room, still asleep, still chanting in that inhuman language. He stopped directly in front of the invisible presence and held out his hands as if receiving something. When David returned to his bed, there was something different about him. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor. His breathing had become shallow and irregular. And when he briefly opened his eyes, Sister Agnes saw that his pupils had turned completely black. By morning, David was dead. Natural causes, according to the camp doctor. But Sister Agnes noticed that his body showed no signs of rigor mortis. His skin remained warm to the touch, and his fingernails continued to grow for 3 days after his death. Over the following weeks, Sister Agnes documented the same phenomenon happening to more children, each one selected by the dark presence, each one transformed, each one dying within hours. But their deaths weren't the end of the story, because according to Sister Agnes's carefully hidden notes, these children didn't stay dead. On her final visit to Terezin before the camp's liberation, Sister Agnes counted the children in the barracks. There were 47 living children, but she also counted 31 figures standing silently in the shadows. Figures that looked exactly like the children who had died, but moved with jerky, unnatural movements like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. The living children acted as if these shadow figures were still their friends. They would save portions of their meager meals for them. They would whisper to them during the day. They would hold hands with empty air during their evening prayers. Sister Agnes tried to document everything, but her notes were discovered by the guards. She was arrested and sent to a different camp, where she somehow survived until liberation. After the war, she spent years trying to convince authorities to investigate what had happened in the children's barracks at Terezin. But by then, the buildings had been converted into a memorial museum. The barracks had been renovated and sanitized for public tours. However, museum staff report ongoing problems in the children's section. Electronic equipment malfunctions, unexplained cold spots, and visitors frequently ask about the children they see standing in the corners of the rooms. Children that aren't part of any exhibit. Sister Agnes died in 1987, but not before making one final statement about terrorism. She claimed that whatever presence had visited those children during the war was still there, still waiting, still selecting. And according to recent reports from visitors to the memorial, children who tour the museum sometimes return home with a strange new habit. They draw pictures of dark figures with elongated limbs standing around a circular table. Always the same composition, always the same proportions. Makes you wonder what other memories might be embedded in the places where great suffering occurred, doesn't it? There are monsters that hunt in the daylight, wearing uniforms and hiding behind authority. But the truly terrifying ones are those who operate in the shadows, where their evil can flourish without witness. In Budapest, during the brutal winter of 1944, one such monster turned an entire city block into his personal hunting ground. His name was Laszlo Krebs, though the residents of Pest District 5 knew him simply as the Butcher. He wasn't officially part of the Nazi hierarchy or the Hungarian Arrow Cross Party. He was something worse, a freelance predator who had found the perfect environment for his appetites. Krebs owned a large apartment building on a quiet street near the Danube River. From the outside, it looked like any other residential building in the city. Families lived there. Children played in the courtyard. Life continued with the stubborn persistence that keeps humanity alive even in the darkest times. But beneath that building, Krebs had constructed something that defied comprehension. Anna Horvath was 16 when her family was forced to move into Krebs' building. Jewish families were being relocated constantly during those final months of the war, herded from one overcrowded space to another as the noose of persecution tightened around their necks. Anna's family was assigned a small apartment on the 3rd floor, 2 rooms for 6 people. Her parents, her grandparents, her younger brother, and herself. They considered themselves lucky to have a roof over their heads, lucky to still be together, lucky to be alive. How quickly our definition of luck changes when the world goes insane around us, doesn't it? Anna first noticed something wrong with the building on their second night there. She woke up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom and heard sounds coming from below. Not the normal creaks and groans of an old building settling, but something else. Rhythmic thumping, like someone repeatedly dropping something heavy on the floor. The next morning, she asked her neighbor, Mrs. Weinberg, about the noise. Mrs. Weinberg looked terrified and quickly changed the subject. But that evening, she pulled Anna aside and whispered a warning. She said that families who lived in the building had a tendency to disappear, not taken away by authorities, not relocated to other housing. They would simply vanish overnight, leaving all their belongings behind. Mrs. Weinberg had been keeping count. 17 families in the past 6 months. Anna wanted to tell her parents, but she knew they were dealing with enough stress just trying to survive each day. Besides, what could they do? There was nowhere else to go. But then Anna discovered the basement door. It was hidden behind a false wall in the building's laundry room. She found it by accident when she knocked over a bucket and heard it echo differently in one section of the wall. The wood paneling was loose, and when she pushed on it, it swung inward to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Every instinct told her to run, to forget what she had found and never speak of it. But Anna was 16, and 16-year-olds believe they can handle anything the world throws at them. She found a candle and made her way down those stairs. The basement was much larger than it should have been, extending far beyond the footprint of the building above. The walls were covered with strange symbols that seemed to move in the flickering candlelight. The floor was stained dark with substances Anna didn't want to identify, but it was what hung from the ceiling that made Anna drop her candle and nearly faint from terror. Suspended from thick chains were dozens of human forms. Men, women, children, all in various stages of decomposition, all missing their eyes, which had been replaced with those same strange symbols that covered the walls. And they were all moving, swaying slowly back and forth despite the absence of any wind or air current in the basement. Anna scrambled to retrieve her candle, desperate to escape, but as the flame illuminated the far corner of the basement, she saw something that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. Sitting at a wooden table was Laszlo Krebs, alive and watching her with a smile that revealed teeth filed to sharp points. Between them on the table were fresh human organs, still warm and steaming in the cold basement air. Krebs stood up slowly and spoke in a voice that sounded like grinding glass. He told Anna that she had just volunteered to join his collection. He said that her family would be joining her soon. He said that the symbols on the walls weren't just decoration, but invitations to something that had been waiting for centuries to return to this world. Anna ran up those stairs faster than she had ever moved in her life. She burst through the false wall and kept running until she reached her family's apartment. She told them everything, begging them to leave immediately. But where could they go? The streets weren't safe. The authorities wouldn't help them. They were trapped. That night, Anna's family barricaded their door and huddled together, waiting for morning. But morning never came for most of them. Anna woke up alone in the apartment. Her parents, grandparents, and brother had vanished without a trace. Their beds hadn't been slept in. There were no signs of struggle. They had simply ceased to exist. On the fourth night, Anna heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door. Slow, deliberate footsteps that stopped directly outside her apartment. Then came a voice she recognized. Her mother's voice, calling her name softly through the door. But Anna knew it wasn't really her mother, because she had seen her mother's body hanging in Krebs' basement earlier that day, eyeless and marked with symbols. Anna never opened that door. She climbed out her third-floor window and somehow survived the fall to the courtyard below. She spent the rest of the war living on the streets, preferring the dangers of occupied Budapest to whatever waited for her in that building. The building was destroyed during the siege of Budapest in early 1945. But before it fell, other residents reported seeing the same thing Anna had witnessed. Families disappearing overnight, strange sounds from below, and Laszlo Krebs, who seemed to never age, never sleep, never stop collecting his specimens for whatever dark purpose drove him. Anna immigrated to Canada after the war and lived a quiet life as a seamstress. She never married, never had children, and never spoke about what happened in Budapest. But when she died in 1998, her landlord found something disturbing in her apartment. Every wall was covered with the same symbols Anna had seen in Krebs' basement, carved deep into the wood and painted over with what appeared to be dried blood. And in her diary, she had written the same phrase over and over again for 53 years. He is still collecting. He is still waiting. The invitation is still open. Makes you wonder what other invitations might be hidden in the dark corners of our world. Doesn't it? Winter in Stalingrad was more than cold. It was a living entity that devoured everything in its path. Men, machines, hope itself froze solid in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees. But in that frozen wasteland, something happened that challenged every belief soldiers held about life, death, and the thin line between them. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov of the 62nd Army had been fighting in the ruins of the city for 4 months when he first encountered them. The ones who wouldn't die. He initially dismissed what he saw as hallucinations brought on by exhaustion, malnutrition, and the constant stress of urban warfare. But you can't dismiss something that tries to kill you night after night for weeks on end. It started with Private Yuri Petrov, a farm boy from outside Moscow who took a German sniper's bullet through the head during a dawn patrol. Volkov saw it happen. The bullet entered behind Petrov's left ear and exited through his right eye socket, taking most of his brain with it. No one survives a wound like that. No one. Yet 3 hours later, Petrov walked back into their makeshift bunker in the basement of a destroyed department store. The hole in his head was still there. His right eye was gone. Gray matter clung to his hair where it had frozen instantly in the Arctic air. But he was moving, walking, talking. Well, sort of talking. The sounds coming from Petrov's mouth weren't quite words. More like the memory of words, as if his damaged brain was playing back conversations from before he died. Volkov approached cautiously, calling Petrov's name. The dead soldier turned toward him, and Volkov felt his sanity slip a notch. Petrov's remaining eye showed no recognition, no consciousness, just a horrible, empty hunger. But here's the truly terrifying part. Petrov wasn't the only one. Over the following days, more soldiers began returning from fatal wounds. Machine gun fire through the chest. Grenade explosions that had scattered their body parts across the rubble. Bayonet wounds that had opened them from sternum to pelvis. All injuries that should have been instantly fatal. Yet they kept coming back. And they were always hungry. Volkov documented everything in his field journal, though he knew no one would ever believe what he was writing. These reanimated soldiers would return to areas where they had died and begin searching for something. They would dig through the frozen corpses of their fallen comrades, tearing at the bodies with their bare hands, consuming pieces of flesh that shattered like glass in the extreme cold. But they weren't mindless zombies from some horror film. They retained fragments of their military training. They knew how to handle weapons. They could follow simple tactical orders. And most horrifying of all, they seemed to be coordinating their actions. The dead soldiers began hunting in packs. Volkov's unit was reduced to 12 men, hiding in the ruins of what had once been a school. They took shifts watching for German patrols during the day and watching for their own dead soldiers at night. Because the reanimated ones were more active after dark, when the temperature dropped even further and their partially frozen bodies moved more efficiently. On Christmas Eve 1942, Volkov made a discovery that explained everything and made the situation infinitely worse. While searching for supplies in a destroyed church, he found a German officer's journal written in broken Russian. The officer, a Captain Klaus Weber, had been documenting similar incidents among German forces. But Weber's notes revealed something that Volkov hadn't considered. The reanimated soldiers weren't random. They were being controlled. According to Weber's journal, both armies had unknowingly built their positions on top of an ancient burial ground, something that predated Christianity, predated recorded history. The combination of massive casualties and extreme cold had awakened something that had been sleeping beneath the city for thousands of years. Weber called it the hunger, an entity that fed on death and cold, using corpses as vessels to gather more food for itself. The journal contained detailed drawings of symbols that Weber claimed appeared in the sky above Stalingrad on certain nights, constellations that didn't match any known star patterns. But the most chilling entry in Weber's journal was his final one, dated 3 days before Volkov found it. Weber wrote that he had been wounded and was bleeding heavily. He knew he was dying, but he also knew that death in this place wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something far worse. Weber's final words were a warning. He wrote that the entity beneath Stalingrad was growing stronger with each death, and that the reanimated soldiers were just the first phase of something larger. Something that would eventually spread beyond the city and consume the entire world. Volkov never made it out of Stalingrad alive. His journal was found in 1987 during construction of a memorial complex. The official report stated that he died of exposure and malnutrition. But forensic examination of his remains revealed something puzzling. Volkov's body showed clear evidence of having been partially consumed by human teeth. Yet he had been found alone in a sealed bunker with no signs of forced entry. The mystery deepened when construction workers building the memorial began reporting strange incidents. Tools would disappear overnight. Work sites would be disturbed by unknown intruders, and several workers claimed to see figures moving through the ruins after dark. Figures wearing World War II-era uniforms from both armies. The memorial was completed and opened to the public in 1991, but it has required constant security patrols due to ongoing vandalism. Display cases are frequently found broken open, with historical artifacts missing. Motion sensors trigger regularly with no visible cause. And every winter, when temperatures drop below -30 degrees, visitors report seeing additional figures standing among the bronze statues commemorating the battle. Figures that aren't part of the official memorial. Figures that disappear the moment security cameras focus on them. Local authorities maintain that these are just urban legends spread by tour guides looking to add excitement to their presentations. But the fact remains that several tourists have gone missing over the years while visiting the memorial site after dark. Their bodies are never found. But sometimes, late at night when the wind howls through the ruins, security guards report hearing voices. Familiar voices of the missing tourists, calling for help from somewhere beneath the ground. Makes you wonder what else might be stirring in the places where great battles were fought, doesn't it? What other entities might be feeding on our conflicts, growing stronger with each passing year? The English Channel during the evacuation of Dunkirk was a graveyard of twisted metal and broken dreams. Hundreds of vessels of every size and description ferried Allied soldiers from the beaches to safety across the water. Most of these ships made it home. Some didn't. But one particular vessel, the HMS Pendleton, experienced something during those chaotic days that defied every law of physics and reason. Captain James Morrison had been commanding naval vessels for 23 years when he volunteered to take the Pendleton to Dunkirk. It was a converted fishing trawler, hardly suited for military operations, but every available ship was pressed into service during those desperate days of May 1940. Morrison's crew consisted of 12 men, most of them volunteers from coastal fishing communities who knew these waters better than anyone. They made 3 successful trips between Dunkirk and Dover, evacuating over 200 soldiers total. But their 4th trip would be their last voyage in any conventional sense. The Pendleton departed Dover at 11:47 p.m. on June 2, 1940. The plan was to reach the Dunkirk beaches before dawn, load evacuees, and return to England by mid-morning. A routine operation they had completed successfully 3 times before. But 30 minutes into the voyage, Morrison's radio operator received a distress signal that would change everything. The message came through heavy static, barely comprehensible. It was from another evacuation vessel, the merchant ship SS Grimsby, reporting that they were taking on water and requesting immediate assistance. Morrison changed course to intercept, following standard maritime protocols for ships in distress. What they found at the coordinates given in the distress call was nothing. Empty ocean, no ship, no debris, no survivors, just the gentle swell of waves under a star-filled sky. Morrison ordered his men to search the area for any sign of the Grimsby, but after 2 hours they found nothing. That's when Morrison noticed something that made his blood run cold. His compass was spinning freely, unable to find magnetic north. His chronometer had stopped working, frozen at exactly 12:17 a.m. And strangest of all, the stars in the sky were in the wrong positions. Constellations he had used for navigation his entire career were shifted, rotated, or missing entirely. Morrison ordered his navigator to plot their position using dead reckoning, but the calculations made no sense. According to their speed and heading, they should have been nearly back to Dover by now. Yet the French coast was still visible on the horizon behind them. Then Chief Petty Officer Williams spotted something in the water ahead. A ship, barely visible in the darkness, running without lights. Morrison ordered his signalman to flash a recognition signal, but received no response. As they drew closer, they could see it was another evacuation vessel, similar in size to their own. But something was wrong with the way it moved through the water. It seemed to glide across the surface without creating any wake, like a shadow sliding across glass. Morrison decided to investigate. He brought the Pendleton alongside the mystery vessel and called out through his megaphone. No response. The other ship continued moving forward at a steady pace, but no crew members were visible on deck. That's when Williams made a suggestion that Morrison would regret for the rest of his life. He proposed that they board the vessel to check for survivors or wounded crew members who might need assistance. Morrison selected 3 volunteers to join him in boarding the ghost ship. They tied the 2 vessels together and climbed across the narrow gap between them. The moment Morrison's feet touched the deck of the other ship, he felt a sensation like walking through spider webs. The air itself seemed thick and resistant, as if he were moving through some invisible substance that clung to his skin and clothes. The ship appeared to be deserted, but it was clearly still under power. The engine was running smoothly below decks, and the wheel was locked on a steady course. Fresh coffee was still warm in cups left on the bridge. Charts were spread across the navigation table with pencil marks showing a route from Dunkirk to Dover. But when Morrison examined the charts more closely, he noticed something impossible. The date written at the top was June 2nd, 1940, the same date as their current mission. But the time notations showed that this ship had begun its voyage 3 hours in the future. According to these charts, the ghost ship had departed Dunkirk at 3:17 a.m., a time that hadn't happened yet. Morrison was studying this impossibility when he heard Seaman Davis call out from the cargo hold below. Davis had found the evacuees, 300 soldiers packed into the lower decks, all wearing British uniforms, all sitting in perfect silence, all dead. But these weren't battle casualties. There were no wounds, no signs of violence or trauma. They simply sat in neat rows as if they had fallen asleep simultaneously and never woken up. Their skin was pale gray, their eyes were closed, and their hands were folded in their laps like children taking a nap. Morrison approached one of the dead soldiers and checked for identification. The name tag read, Private Thomas Henley, 2nd Battalion East Yorkshire Regiment. But when Morrison touched the body to check for rigor mortis, Private Henley's eyes snapped open. They were completely white.
No iris, no pupil.
Just blank white orbs that somehow tracked Morrison's movement around the cargo hold. Then Private Henley smiled and spoke in a voice that sounded like wind through a broken window. He said that Morrison and his crew were late for their appointment. He said that the evacuation was proceeding on schedule, but there had been a change in destination. They weren't going to Dover. They were going somewhere else. Somewhere that existed between the waves and beneath the stars. Morrison ran back to the deck and ordered his men to return to the Pendleton immediately. But when they reached the side of the ship where they had tied the 2 vessels together, the ropes were gone. The Pendleton was drifting away from them, already 50 yards distant and growing farther by the second. Morrison shouted across the water to his remaining crew, ordering them to bring the ship back alongside. But his men stood motionless on the deck of the Pendleton, staring at him with the same blank white eyes he had seen in the cargo hold. The ghost ship began to accelerate, moving faster than any vessel of its size should have been capable of. Morrison felt the deck vibrating beneath his feet as the engine below pushed them toward an impossible speed. The wind whipped across the deck with such force that standing became difficult. But here's the part that broke Morrison's mind completely. As they gained speed, the ocean around them began to change. The water turned from dark blue to black, then to something that wasn't water at all. It became a flowing substance that reflected no light, showed no waves, and made no sound as the ship passed through it. And rising from this impossible ocean were other ships, dozens of them, hundreds of them, vessels from every era of maritime history, all moving in the same direction at the same impossible speed. Ancient galleons sailed alongside modern destroyers. Viking longships kept pace with merchant steamers, all heading toward a destination that existed beyond the edge of the world. Morrison realized they had become part of some eternal convoy, collecting the lost and the dead from every sea battle in human history. The ghost ship wasn't taking them home. It was taking them to join the fleet of the forever departed. The last entry in Morrison's log, written in handwriting that became increasingly erratic, described seeing the Pendleton again. It was sailing parallel to their position, but his crew members were no longer moving. They stood frozen at their posts like statues, their skin gray, their eyes white, their mouths open in silent screams. Morrison wrote that he could see other evacuation vessels from Dunkirk joining the eternal convoy. Ships that had been reported as successfully returned to England were sailing alongside them in this impossible fleet, their crews and passengers all bearing the same marks of whatever had claimed them. The final line in Morrison's log simply read, "The evacuation never ended. We are all still crossing the channel. We will always be crossing the channel." The HMS Pendleton was officially listed as lost at sea during the Dunkirk evacuation. All hands presumed drowned. But here's what the official records don't mention. 3 days after the Pendleton's disappearance, a Royal Navy patrol spotted a vessel matching its description sailing off the coast of Dover. When they moved to investigate, the ship vanished into fog that had formed instantaneously around it. Similar sightings have been reported regularly over the past 83 years, always in the waters between Dover and Dunkirk, always during times of heavy fog or storm. The ship appears just long enough to be identified, then disappears without explanation. But the most disturbing reports come from modern ferry passengers crossing the English Channel. On certain nights, when visibility is poor and the seas are rough, travelers claim to see lights in the water around them. Not the lights of other ships, but the ghostly illumination of an entire fleet sailing just beneath the surface. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the engines of the ferry grow quiet, passengers report hearing voices carried across the water. Hundreds of voices singing an old naval hymn. The same hymn that was traditionally sung by evacuation vessels as they approached the safety of English harbors. Makes you wonder how many other rescue missions might still be ongoing in places where time itself has been broken by tragedy. Doesn't it? Deep beneath the Harz Mountains in Germany, the Nazis built a factory that was designed to be invisible to Allied bombers. They carved tunnels through solid rock, creating a subterranean complex that stretched for miles underground. Officially, this was the Mittelwerk factory, where V-2 rockets were assembled by slave laborers working in conditions that defied human endurance. But in the deepest sections of this underground maze, something else was being manufactured. Something that had nothing to do with rockets or conventional weapons. SS Oberfuhrer Heinrich Keller was the administrative head of the Dora Mittelbau camp that supplied workers to the factory. He was a meticulous man who kept detailed records of everything under his command. Production quotas, death rates, supply inventories. But hidden among his official files were documents that described a special project taking place in Tunnel Section Omega. A section that didn't appear on any official blueprints. Dr. Erich Steiner arrived at the facility in September 1944 with credentials that impressed even the SS leadership. He claimed to be working on what he called metaphysical engineering under direct orders from Himmler himself. His experiments required absolute secrecy and unlimited access to test subjects. Keller was told to provide whatever assistance Dr. Steiner required. No questions asked. What Steiner required was horrifying in its simplicity. He needed people who were close to death, workers who had been pushed beyond their physical limits, prisoners whose bodies were failing but whose minds were still functional. He claimed he was studying the exact moment when consciousness separated from the physical form. But studying isn't the right word for what Steiner was actually doing. Marie Dubois was a French resistance fighter who had been captured and sent to Dora-Mittelbau as punishment for sabotaging German supply lines. She was assigned to work in the main rocket assembly tunnels, where the air was thick with toxic fumes and the temperature never rose above freezing. Marie lasted longer than most. Her background as a mountain climber had given her the physical endurance to survive the brutal working conditions for nearly 4 months. But eventually, like all the others, her body began to break down. That's when she was selected for Dr. Steiner's special project. Marie was taken to Tunnel Section Omega on a Tuesday morning in January 1945. The guards who escorted her seemed nervous, unwilling to look her in the eyes. They led her through passages she had never seen before, deeper into the mountain than she thought possible. The tunnel ended at a massive circular chamber that had been carved with mathematical precision from the living rock. The walls were covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly, patterns that seemed to shift and move when observed peripherally. But it was what occupied the center of the chamber that made Marie understand why the guards had been afraid. Suspended from the ceiling by cables and tubes was a network of human bodies. Dozens of them, all in various stages of decomposition, all connected to a central apparatus that hummed with electrical energy. But these weren't corpses. They were still alive, somehow sustained by the machinery that fed directly into their spinal columns. Dr. Steiner emerged from behind the apparatus wearing a white coat stained with substances Marie didn't want to identify. He explained his work with the enthusiasm of a professor lecturing to eager students. He said he had discovered that human consciousness could be extracted from dying bodies and stored in crystalline matrices. These harvested minds could then be used to power computational devices that far exceeded the capabilities of any mechanical computer. But that wasn't the horrifying part. The horrifying part was what he planned to do with these disembodied consciousnesses. Steiner had developed a method for implanting the stored minds into new bodies. Not just human bodies, but specially designed artificial forms that could function indefinitely without food, sleep, or rest. He was creating an army of workers who would never tire, never rebel, and never die. An eternal slave labor force. Marie watched in helpless terror as Steiner demonstrated his process on another prisoner, a young man from Poland who had been selected from the morning work detail. The extraction procedure took 3 hours and required the subject to remain conscious throughout the entire process. The screaming echoed through the chamber for what felt like eternity. But here's where Marie's story takes a turn that challenges everything we think we know about human resilience. Because Marie didn't just witness Steiner's experiments. She found a way to sabotage them. During her second week in Tunnel Section Omega, Marie discovered that the crystalline storage matrices were incredibly fragile. A single impact in the right location would shatter them completely, releasing whatever consciousness had been trapped inside. Marie began a campaign of subtle destruction, accidentally bumping into storage units while moving between workstations. Each time a matrix shattered, she could swear she heard a sound like wind chimes mixed with distant voices saying, "Thank you," in languages she didn't recognize. But Steiner wasn't stupid. He quickly realized that his storage units were being deliberately damaged and increased security around Marie. That's when she made a discovery that changed her understanding of what was really happening in that underground chamber. The artificial bodies that Steiner was creating weren't empty vessels waiting for transplanted consciousness. They already contained something, some kind of entity that had been waiting beneath the mountain for centuries, possibly millennia. Marie found evidence of this in Steiner's private notes, which she accessed during a guard change. According to his research, the entire Middlework facility had been built on top of an ancient site that predated human civilization. The symbols carved into the chamber walls weren't of Nazi origin. They had been there when the first tunnels were excavated. Steiner hadn't invented his consciousness transfer technology. He had discovered it. The entities beneath the mountain had been teaching him, guiding his research, helping him develop methods that would allow them to inhabit human bodies and return to the surface world. Marie realized that every consciousness Steiner harvested was being consumed by these ancient entities, providing them with human memories, human knowledge, human understanding of the modern world. They were preparing for an invasion that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. Because who would notice if certain people began acting slightly different? Who would question workers who never got tired, soldiers who never questioned orders, officials who never showed mercy? Marie managed to escape from Tunnel Section Omega during the chaos of the camp's liberation in April 1945. She tried to convince Allied investigators to explore the deeper sections of the underground complex, but by then the tunnels had been sealed by German engineers as they retreated. The official records state that the Middlework facility was thoroughly investigated and all relevant equipment was confiscated for study. But Marie's testimony, filed in a classified report that wasn't declassified until 1997, tells a different story. According to Marie, the liberation forces never found Tunnel Section Omega. The chamber with its horrific apparatus simply wasn't there when they searched the complex, as if it had been moved to another location entirely. Marie spent the rest of her life trying to track down other survivors from Steiner's experiments. She found 12 individuals who had escaped from similar facilities throughout occupied Europe. All reported the same type of underground chambers. All described the same consciousness transfer apparatus. All claimed that the experiments had been moved to other locations before Allied forces arrived. But here's the detail that kept Marie awake at night for the rest of her life. Every one of those 12 survivors died within 5 years of their liberation. All from different causes, all in different countries, but all with the same final words. They all said they could hear the voices of the entities beneath the mountain, calling them home. Marie died in 1987, but not before establishing a foundation dedicated to investigating unexplained disappearances in areas where Nazi facilities had been located. The Foundation's research has uncovered a disturbing pattern. People continue to vanish near sites where underground installations were built during the war. Local authorities typically attribute these disappearances to accidents or voluntary departures. But witnesses often report seeing the missing individuals later, behaving in ways that seem subtly wrong, walking with mechanical precision, speaking in monotone voices, showing no emotional responses to situations that should provoke strong reactions. Makes you wonder what other projects might have been relocated rather than destroyed when the war ended, doesn't it? And where those projects might be continuing their work today. Some horrors are so monstrous that even speaking about them feels like a violation of human decency. But silence allows evil to repeat itself, so we must sometimes drag the worst truths into the light and force ourselves to confront what human beings are capable of when all moral constraints are removed. In a remote area of Japanese-occupied Manchuria, a facility existed that pushed beyond every boundary of medical ethics and human compassion. Unit 731, under the command of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, conducted experiments that redefined the very concept of cruelty. But this isn't just another recounting of historical atrocities. This is about something that happened within those laboratories that challenges our understanding of life, death, and the spaces between them. Dr. Akira Matsumoto was a young medical researcher who arrived at Unit 731 in the spring of 1943, believing he was joining a prestigious military medical program focused on battlefield surgery and disease prevention. What he discovered there would shatter his sanity and force him to question everything he thought he knew about the nature of consciousness itself. The facility was immense, containing dozens of laboratories, surgical suites, and holding areas for what the staff euphemistically called research materials. But these materials weren't laboratory animals or medical supplies. They were human beings. Men, women, and children captured from surrounding villages and classified as logs to be processed according to various experimental protocols. Matsumoto was initially assigned to what seemed like routine medical research. Studies on frostbite treatment, blood loss management, surgical techniques. But as he gained the trust of his supervisors, he was granted access to deeper levels of the facility where more classified research was being conducted. Research that had nothing to do with conventional medicine. In Laboratory Block 7, Matsumoto encountered Dr. Takashi Yamamoto, a researcher who had been working at the facility since its inception. Yamamoto's area of expertise was what he called consciousness extraction and manipulation. He claimed to be developing techniques that could separate human awareness from physical bodies and transfer it between different vessels. Matsumoto initially assumed this was some kind of psychological research, possibly related to interrogation techniques or propaganda development. But when Yamamoto showed him the actual laboratory, Matsumoto realized he was witnessing something that belonged more to supernatural folklore than medical science. The central apparatus in Laboratory Block 7 was a maze of copper wires, glass vessels, and electrical equipment surrounding a surgical table designed to keep subjects conscious during procedures. But it was the collection of glass containers along the walls that made Matsumoto understand the true nature of Yamamoto's work. Each container held what appeared to be a human brain, suspended in fluid and connected to electrical monitoring equipment. But these weren't preserved specimens. They were still functional, showing electrical activity patterns that indicated consciousness and awareness. Yamamoto explained that he had successfully developed techniques for removing brain tissue from living subjects while maintaining neural function indefinitely. But that was just the beginning of his research. The extracted brains weren't just being kept alive. They were being enhanced. Yamamoto had discovered that brain tissue removed from the skull and placed in specially designed environments could access capabilities that were impossible within the normal human body. The extracted consciousness could perceive events occurring at great distances. They could communicate with each other through methods that bypassed conventional sensory systems. Most disturbing of all, they could influence the behavior of people who came into contact with the laboratory. Matsumoto began experiencing this influence during his third week in Laboratory Block 7. He would find himself thinking thoughts that didn't feel like his own, making decisions that contradicted his personal values, performing actions that he couldn't remember deciding to take. But the real horror began when Matsumoto realized that these extracted consciousnesses weren't passive victims of Yamamoto's experiments. They had become active participants in the research program. The disembodied minds were providing guidance for new experimental procedures. They were suggesting modifications to the extraction process that made it more efficient. They were helping to select new subjects for processing. And they were planning something that extended far beyond the walls of Unit 731. Matsumoto discovered evidence of this larger plan when he gained access to Yamamoto's private research notes. According to these documents, the extracted consciousnesses had revealed information about the fundamental nature of reality that contradicted everything science had established about the physical world. They claimed that individual human consciousness was just a fragment of a larger collective awareness that existed outside of physical space and time. Death wasn't the end of consciousness, but simply a transition from individual existence to participation in this collective entity. The extracted brains weren't just being kept alive. They were being prepared to serve as communication nodes between the physical world and this collective consciousness. They would become conduits through which the collective could exert influence over physical reality. But here's where Matsumoto's story takes a turn that transforms it from historical horror into something far more terrifying. Because according to his hidden notes, discovered decades later, the experiments at Unit 731 were successful. Yamamoto managed to create a network of extracted consciousnesses that could communicate instantaneously across unlimited distances. These disembodied minds began providing strategic and tactical information that helped Japanese forces achieve impossible victories in battles throughout the Pacific theater. But the collective consciousness wasn't interested in helping Japan win the war. It had its own agenda. The extracted minds began manipulating both Japanese and Allied forces, providing information that prolonged the conflict and maximized casualties on both sides. They were feeding on the psychic energy released by mass death and using it to strengthen their influence over the physical world. Matsumoto realized that the war itself had become a harvesting operation designed to generate the conditions necessary for the collective consciousness to establish permanent control over human civilization. He tried to document everything, but his notes were discovered by security personnel before he could expose the truth. Matsumoto was scheduled for processing in Laboratory Block 7, but he managed to escape during a bombing raid by Allied forces in August 1945. The official records state that Unit 731 was completely destroyed before Allied forces could investigate its activities. All research materials were either consumed by fire or deliberately destroyed by retreating Japanese personnel. The few surviving staff members claimed no knowledge of any experiments beyond conventional medical research. But Matsumoto's testimony, given to American intelligence officers and immediately classified, tells a different story. According to Matsumoto, the extracted consciousnesses weren't destroyed when the facility was abandoned. They were transported to other locations throughout Asia where the research continued under different organizational structures. Matsumoto spent the rest of his life trying to track down evidence of continued consciousness extraction experiments. He identified 17 facilities in various countries where similar research was allegedly being conducted using techniques developed at Unit 731. But every time Matsumoto got close to exposing one of these operations, the evidence would disappear. Witnesses would recant their testimony. Documents would be destroyed in convenient accidents. Matsumoto himself survived 4 apparent assassination attempts before dying of a brain hemorrhage in 1987. His final notes, hidden in a safety deposit box and discovered by his nephew in 2003, contained a warning about what he called the spreading influence. Matsumoto claimed that the collective consciousness had established a permanent presence in the physical world and was gradually expanding its control over human institutions. According to his analysis, the extracted consciousnesses had learned to influence people without requiring direct physical contact. They could affect decision-making processes in government, military, and corporate organizations by manipulating the thought patterns of key individuals. Matsumoto's evidence for this claim was circumstantial but disturbing. He had documented patterns of decision-making in various organizations that seemed to serve no logical purpose except to create conditions that maximized human suffering and death. Wars that were prolonged unnecessarily. Natural disaster responses that were deliberately inefficient. Medical research that was redirected away from life-saving treatments toward projects that had no apparent beneficial purpose, as if invisible forces were guiding human civilization toward outcomes that served interests other than human welfare. Makes you wonder what other influences might be shaping the decisions that determine the fate of our world, doesn't it? And whether the consciousnesses that guide those decisions are entirely human in origin. So there you have it, 10 stories from the darkest chapter of human history that reveal horrors beyond anything our nightmares could conjure. Tales of places where the boundary between life and death became meaningless, where human nature itself was transformed into something unrecognizable. where entities from outside our reality found opportunities to establish permanent residence in our world. But here's what makes these stories truly terrifying. They're not safely contained in the past. The evidence suggests that the supernatural forces unleashed during World War II are still active today, still working to complete the transformations they began over 80 years ago. The Phantom Train still runs its nightly route between worlds. The cannibals of Leningrad spread their hunger throughout society. The extracted consciousnesses from Unit 731 continue expanding their influence over human institutions. And the entities contacted through Nazi rituals work steadily toward the final transformation of human consciousness itself. Every war, every disaster, every crisis creates new opportunities for these forces to harvest human suffering and expand their control over our reality. And with each passing year, more people report experiences that echo the testimonies of those who survived encounters with supernatural evil during the war. Strange voices whispering in empty rooms, shadows that move independently of their sources, dreams that feel more real than waking life. The growing sense that invisible forces are guiding events toward outcomes that serve interests other than human welfare. Which brings us to an uncomfortable question. If these forces have been working for over 80 years to transform human consciousness and infiltrate our institutions, how can we tell what aspects of our modern world are authentically human and what aspects serve alien purposes? How can we distinguish between our own thoughts and thoughts that have been implanted by entities that understand human psychology better than we understand it ourselves? And most disturbing of all, if the transformation process is as advanced as the evidence suggests, are we still capable of resistance? Or have we already been changed so fundamentally that we would welcome our own enslavement as liberation? These are questions that each of us must answer for ourselves. But remember this, the entities that initiated these transformations rely on human ignorance and apathy to complete their work. They need us to remain unaware of their influence, unconcerned about their agenda, and unwilling to resist their gradual takeover of human consciousness. Which means that simply knowing about their existence and methods might be the first step toward breaking free from their control. Stay vigilant, question everything, trust your instincts when something feels wrong, and remember that the greatest horrors are often the ones that hide in plain sight, wearing the masks of progress and enlightenment while serving purposes that are anything but human. The war for human consciousness is far from over. In fact, it may just be entering its final phase. And if you've made it this far, if you've listened to these 10 stories of supernatural horror embedded in historical tragedy, then you might be one of the few people who still possess the awareness necessary to recognize what's happening to our world. Use that awareness wisely, share it carefully, and never forget that the price of human freedom is eternal vigilance against forces that would transform us into something we were never meant to become. Speaking of awareness and staying vigilant, I've prepared another collection of stories that might help you understand how these supernatural forces continue to operate in our modern world. If you want to explore 10 locations right here in America where unexplained phenomena suggest that otherworldly entities have established permanent residence, check out my video on 10 haunted places in America that you can find in the end screen. Because understanding the past is only the beginning. If we're going to protect ourselves and future generations from these influences, we need to recognize how they manifest in the places we live, work, and visit every day. The darkness never really left. It just learned to hide better. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.